On August 9th, 48 BC, Julius Caesar stood before 22,000 exhausted, half-starved legionaries and prepared to face Pompey the Great's 45,000 veteran soldiers and 7,000 cavalry. By sunset, the Roman Republic's most powerful army lay shattered, and history's most brilliant tactical mind had secured his path to dictatorship through the bloodiest day of Roman civil war. Think about those numbers for a second. 22,000 against 52,000. Caesar was outnumbered more than 2 to 1, outflanked by cavalry 7 to 1, and his men hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how he turned certain death into Rome's most decisive victory. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see ancient warfare forever. First, the secret 4th line that Pompey never saw coming. Second, why Rome's most experienced general froze at the critical moment and doomed his army. And third, the 15 minutes of slaughter that killed the Republic itself. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did starving soldiers outfight well-fed veterans at twice their number? What single tactical innovation destroyed 7,000 cavalry in minutes? Why did Pompey abandon 25,000 soldiers and flee to Egypt? How did one man's genius kill 15,000 Romans in a single afternoon? To understand how Caesar gambled everything on one perfect battlefield, we need to step back to when Rome itself was tearing apart at the seams. January 10th, 49 BC. Julius Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon River with 1 legion and faced an impossible choice. Behind him lay Gaul, conquered and pacified after 8 years of brutal warfare. Ahead lay Italy, Rome, and Pompey the Great, the Senate's champion, Caesar's former ally, and now his mortal enemy. Roman law forbade generals from bringing armies into Italy. Cross with his legion, and Caesar became a traitor. Return to Rome without his army, and his political enemies would destroy him through the courts, strip his wealth, exile him, possibly execute him. He had spent the last decade building the most loyal, battle-hardened army Rome had ever seen. Now that army would march against Rome itself. "The die is cast," Caesar reportedly said, and led his men across the river into civil war. Here's what made this moment so catastrophic. For 500 years, Rome had maintained a sacred principle. No general could bring armed forces across the Rubicon, the boundary between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. The law existed for one reason: to prevent military coups. Roman armies were supposed to defend the Republic from external enemies, not threaten it from within. Every general understood that crossing the Rubicon with troops meant declaring war on Rome itself. Caesar crossed it with 5,000 men of the 3rd Legion, 1 understrength legion against the entire might of the Roman state. The political crisis had been building for years. Caesar's enemies in the Senate, led by Cato the Younger and backed by Pompey, had spent months maneuvering to destroy him legally. They demanded Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand trial for alleged crimes committed during his consulship. It was a trap. Without his legions, Caesar had no protection. Roman courts were political theaters where wealthy senators bribed juries and predetermined verdicts. Conviction meant exile at best, execution at worst. Caesar knew exactly what awaited him. But here's where the situation gets genuinely insane. Caesar didn't just face political enemies. He faced Pompey the Great, the most decorated general in Roman history, a man who had conquered more territory than anyone since Alexander. Pompey had legions in Spain, allies throughout the Mediterranean, and the full backing of the Senate's treasury. He had defeated pirates, crushed rebellions, and never lost a major campaign. Going to war against Pompey wasn't just dangerous. It was military suicide. Think about the arithmetic Caesar was calculating on that riverbank. He had 8 legions in Gaul, roughly 40,000 men total, but they were scattered across a province the size of France. Pompey commanded at least 10 legions and could call up dozens more from Rome's allies and provinces. The Senate controlled Rome's wealth, its grain supply, its naval forces. Caesar's entire strategic position depended on speed and surprise. If he hesitated, if he gave Pompey time to concentrate forces, he would be crushed. So Caesar didn't hesitate. On the night of January 10th, he ordered the 13th Legion to break camp and march. Ancient sources report that Caesar himself crossed first, on horseback, deliberately making himself the first Roman general in 500 years to commit this act of treason. The message to his soldiers was clear. I am with you. We do this together. There is no turning back. The legion followed him across the shallow river in the darkness. By dawn, Caesar's forces had penetrated 20 miles into Italy, moving so fast that local garrisons had no time to react. Towns opened their gates or were bypassed entirely. Caesar was betting everything on one strategy. Move faster than Pompey could respond, seize Italy before resistance could organize, and force a political settlement before the full weight of Rome's military power could deploy against him. It was the most audacious gamble in Roman history. And it worked, at first. Within 60 days, Caesar would control all of Italy. Pompey would flee to Greece. The Senate would scatter. But Caesar's rapid victory in Italy would only set the stage for something far more dangerous. A final confrontation between Rome's 2 greatest generals. A battle that would determine whether the Republic survived or died. And that battle would be fought on a plain in Greece called Pharsalus, where impossible odds and brilliant tactics would collide in the bloodiest day of Rome's civil war. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, wasn't just a rival. He was a living legend, a man who had conquered more territory than any Roman in history. At age 23, he had raised his own army and crushed an enemy rebellion. By 30, he had defeated Sertorius in Spain, eliminated the pirates who terrorized the Mediterranean, and conquered the East, Syria, Judea, Armenia. He had personally added more land to Rome than anyone since the Republic's founding. The Senate loved him. The people worshipped him. Even Caesar had married his daughter Julia to Pompey to secure their alliance. But Julia died in childbirth in 54 BC, and the bond between Rome's 2 greatest generals died with her. By 49 BC, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Pompey commanded the loyalty of the Senate, the wealth of the eastern provinces, and the respect of Rome's military establishment. He was 58 years old, experienced, politically powerful, and he had never lost a major battle in his life. Let that sink in for a moment. Pompey had been winning battles for 35 consecutive years. He had fought in Africa, Spain, Italy, Greece, Asia Minor, and Judea. He had defeated slave armies, pirates, foreign kings, and Roman rebels. His military record was literally perfect. 0 major defeats in over 3 decades of continuous warfare. When Roman mothers wanted their sons to grow up strong, they invoked Pompey's name. When the Senate faced a crisis, they turned to Pompey. When enemies of Rome heard his legions were coming, they surrendered before the fighting started. Here's what made Pompey so dangerous. He wasn't just a battlefield commander, he was a strategic genius who understood how to wage war on a continental scale. In 67 BC, Mediterranean pirates had become so powerful, they were raiding Italian coastal towns and strangling Rome's grain supply. The Senate gave Pompey extraordinary powers. 500 ships, 120,000 soldiers, and authority over the entire Mediterranean. Conventional wisdom said it would take years to defeat the pirates. Pompey did it in 3 months. He divided the Mediterranean into 13 sectors, assigned squadrons to each, and coordinated simultaneous operations across thousands of miles of coastline. The pirates were crushed so thoroughly that Mediterranean piracy effectively ceased to exist for generations. Think about the scale of that achievement. Pompey commanded a military operation spanning from Gibraltar to Syria, coordinating hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men without radio, telegraph, or any communication faster than a horse or sail. And he did it flawlessly. But his greatest triumph came in the east. From 66 to 63 BC, Pompey waged war against Mithridates VI of Pontus, one of Rome's most dangerous enemies, a king who had already fought 2 wars against Rome and once ordered the massacre of 80,000 Roman citizens in a single day. Pompey didn't just defeat Mithridates, he destroyed him, chased him across Asia Minor, and drove him to suicide. Then Pompey kept going. He conquered Armenia, Syria, and Judea. He reached the Euphrates River, Rome's new eastern frontier. He reorganized the entire eastern Mediterranean, creating client kingdoms, establishing trade routes, and generating so much wealth that Rome's treasury doubled. When Pompey returned to Rome in 61 BC, his triumph, the ceremonial parade celebrating military victory, lasted 2 full days. The procession included cartloads of gold and silver, exotic animals from conquered lands, captured enemy kings walking in chains, and placards listing his achievements. 1,000 fortresses captured, 900 cities taken, 12 million people brought under Roman rule, pirate fleets annihilated, 3 continents pacified. But here's what the Senate didn't fully understand until it was too late. Pompey's soldiers weren't just loyal to Rome, they were loyal to Pompey personally. He had made them rich with plunder. He had led them to victory after victory. He had settled thousands of veterans on farms purchased with his own wealth. When the political crisis with Caesar erupted, Pompey could call on a network of former officers, veteran legionaries, and provincial governors who owed him everything. And Pompey had one more advantage that seemed insurmountable: legitimacy. Caesar was a rebel, a lawbreaker, a man who had crossed the Rubicon with armed troops. Pompey was the Senate's chosen defender, fighting to preserve the Republic against a would-be tyrant. Every soldier who joined Pompey could tell himself he was fighting for Rome, not against it. By the summer of 48 BC, when both armies converged on Pharsalus, Pompey commanded 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, twice Caesar's numbers. He had better supplies, better funding, and better strategic positioning. On paper, Caesar didn't stand a chance. But what Pompey didn't know was that his perfect record, his 35 years of unbroken victories, had made him cautious. Success had taught him to avoid risks. And Caesar was about to teach him that sometimes the greatest risk is playing it safe. But Julius Caesar had spent the last 8 years doing something that would change Roman military history forever. He had created the most elite fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. From 58 to 50 BC, Caesar's legions conquered Gaul, a territory roughly the size of modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany. The campaigns were savage. Caesar fought the Helvetii, crushed Germanic tribes, invaded Britain twice, built a bridge across the Rhine in 10 days just to prove he could, and besieged Alesia, where 80,000 Gauls defended a hilltop fortress, while 250,000 more came to rescue them. Caesar trapped them all, built walls facing both directions, and won. His legionaries had spent nearly a decade marching, fighting, and bleeding together. They had learned to build fortifications faster than any army in history. They could march 20 miles in full gear and still fight at the end of it. And they were absolutely, fanatically loyal to Caesar, not to Rome, not to the Senate, but to the man who led them to victory after victory and made them rich with plunder. The Gallic Wars weren't just military campaigns. They were a masterclass in total warfare that transformed ordinary Roman soldiers into the most lethal infantry force on the planet. Caesar's legionaries didn't fight occasional battles. They fought constantly. In 8 years, Caesar's army engaged in over 50 major battles and hundreds of smaller skirmishes. They marched through forests, crossed rivers, scaled mountains, and besieged fortified hilltop towns that seemed impregnable. And they won virtually every encounter. Here's what made Caesar's army so terrifying: adaptability. Traditional Roman legions were rigid, disciplined formations that excelled in set-piece battles on open ground. Caesar's legionaries learned to fight anywhere, anytime, under any conditions. They fought Germanic warriors twice their size in dense forests, where traditional formations were useless. They built naval fleets from scratch to fight the Veneti, a Gallic tribe with superior ships and sailing knowledge. They learned siege warfare, river crossings, mountain fighting, night operations, and how to construct field fortifications so sophisticated that modern military engineers still study them. Think about the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC, the pinnacle of Caesar's tactical genius. Vercingetorix, the Gallic war chief, had united dozens of tribes and assembled 80,000 warriors inside the hilltop fortress of Alesia. Caesar had roughly 60,000 legionaries. A conventional siege would take months and likely fail. So Caesar did something that defied military logic. He built a wall completely encircling Alesia, 11 miles of fortifications, including ditches, sharpened stakes, and wooden walls, designed to trap Vercingetorix inside. Then, when intelligence reported that a relief army of 250,000 Gauls was marching to rescue the besieged fortress, Caesar built a second wall facing outward, another 14 miles of fortifications. Let that sink in. Caesar's army constructed 25 miles of sophisticated defensive works in hostile territory while surrounded by enemies on all sides. They dug ditches 15 feet deep, planted thousands of sharpened stakes in concealed pits, built wooden towers every 80 feet, and created a double-walled fortress with Caesar's legions trapped in the middle, under siege from both directions simultaneously. The final battle at Alesia lasted 2 days. 250,000 Gauls attacked Caesar's outer wall from outside, while 80,000 attacked from inside. Caesar's 60,000 legionaries held both walls, fighting in shifts, rotating fresh troops to critical points, using their fortifications to multiply their effectiveness. When the Gallic relief army finally broke and fled, they left 150,000 dead on the field. Vercingetorix surrendered. Gaul was conquered, and Caesar's soldiers had just proven they could defeat armies 4 times their size through discipline, engineering, and sheer relentless will. But here's what the Senate failed to understand. Caesar's legionaries didn't just respect him, they loved him. He fought alongside them, slept in the same camps, ate the same food. When his men were hungry, Caesar went hungry. When they marched 30 miles in a day, Caesar marched with them. He knew their names, their families, their fears. He made them wealthy through captured plunder and promised them land when they retired. His soldiers called him Imperator, commander. But they meant it as something closer to father, protector, the man they would follow into hell because he had already led them out of it 100 times. Roman historians estimate that during the Gallic Wars, Caesar's legions killed or enslaved over 1 million Gauls. The campaigns generated so much wealth that Caesar personally became one of the richest men in Rome. His soldiers, from the lowest-ranking legionary to his senior officers, shared that wealth. They were professionals who had spent 8 years perfecting the art of war under a commander who had never lost. And now, in 48 BC, that battle-hardened, fanatically loyal army was about to face Pompey's larger, better supplied forces on a plain in Greece. Pompey had the numbers. Caesar had something more dangerous, an army that believed their commander was invincible. The question was whether faith could defeat mathematics. Pharsalus would answer that question in blood. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in January 49 BC, Pompey's strategy was simple. Abandon Italy, retreat to Greece, raise a massive army from Rome's eastern territories, then return and crush Caesar with overwhelming force. It was a sound plan, but it required time. Caesar didn't give him time. In 60 days, Caesar's legions swept through Italy like a wildfire. Towns opened their gates. Pompey's forces retreated, then fled. By March, Pompey had evacuated Italy entirely, sailing to Greece with the Senate, the treasury, and his most loyal troops. Caesar controlled Rome, but Pompey controlled everything else. Spain, Greece, the eastern provinces, Egypt, North Africa. More importantly, Pompey controlled the grain supply. Caesar had won the first round, but he was trapped in Italy with a starving city and no way to feed it. So Caesar did what he always did. He attacked. He marched to Spain, defeated Pompey's lieutenants, then sailed to Greece to face Pompey directly. By summer 48 BC, both armies were in Thessaly, and the final confrontation was inevitable. Here's what made Caesar's Italian campaign so devastating. Pure, relentless speed. His legions marched 40 miles on some days, twice the normal pace for a Roman army. They moved so fast that Pompey's garrisons couldn't coordinate a defense. Towns that might have resisted if they'd had time to prepare simply opened their gates when Caesar's advance scouts appeared. The psychological effect was overwhelming. Caesar wasn't conquering Italy through force. He was conquering it through momentum and the perception of inevitability. By February 17th, just 38 days after, crossing the Rubicon, Caesar controlled everything from the Alps to Rome itself. Pompey had withdrawn to Brundisium, the port city on Italy's southeastern coast, and was desperately trying to evacuate his forces to Greece before Caesar could trap him. Caesar arrived at Brundisium on March 9th and immediately began constructing siege works to block the harbor. But Pompey was too experienced to be caught. On the night of March 17th, he evacuated the last of his troops, approximately 25,000 soldiers and hundreds of senators, under cover of darkness, slipping past Caesar's incomplete blockade and sailing east across the Adriatic. Caesar stood on the docks at Brundisium and watched Pompey's fleet disappear into the night. He had won Italy without fighting a single major battle. But the strategic situation was actually worse now than before he crossed the Rubicon. Think about the nightmare Caesar was facing. Rome's population was roughly 1 million people. The city consumed 400,000 tons of grain annually, and virtually all of it came from overseas. Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, provinces that Pompey now controlled. Caesar had seized political power, but he couldn't feed the city. Within months, Rome would starve. Bread riots would erupt. The people who had welcomed Caesar as a liberator would turn on him as the man who brought famine. Pompey understood this perfectly. His strategy was patient and brutal. Blockade Italy, control the grain, wait for hunger to destroy Caesar's popular support, then return with a massive army assembled from the eastern provinces and reconquer Italy from a weakened, desperate opponent. It was textbook strategy. Deny your enemy resources, let time work in your favor. Strike when he's vulnerable. But here's where Caesar revealed the audacity that made him so dangerous. Instead of staying in Rome trying to manage the grain crisis, he went on the offensive. In April 49th of BC, just weeks after securing Italy, He marched his army to Spain to destroy Pompey's forces there before they could reinforce Pompey in Greece. The campaign was brutal. Caesar's legions besieged Ilerda, trapped Pompey's lieutenants Afranius and Petreius with 60,000 troops, and forced their surrender without a major battle. By August, Spain was secured. Then Caesar did something that shocked the Roman world. He built a fleet. Caesar had virtually no naval experience. Pompey controlled the Mediterranean with hundreds of warships. Conventional wisdom said Caesar would never be able to cross to Greece. The naval power differential was too great. Caesar crossed anyway. In January 48 BC, Caesar loaded 7 legions, approximately 35,000 men, onto a hastily assembled fleet of transport ships and sailed directly into the teeth of Pompey's naval blockade. It was a desperate gamble. If Pompey's fleet intercepted the transports, Caesar's army would be destroyed at sea. The crossing took 3 days. Pompey's ships missed them. Caesar landed on the coast of Epirus, in what is now Albania, with half his army. His second-in-command, Mark Antony, had been left behind with the other half because there weren't enough ships for a single crossing. Caesar was now trapped in hostile territory with 35,000 men, no supplies, and no reinforcements, facing Pompey's rapidly assembling army of over 50,000. And Pompey was waiting. The man who had never lost a major battle in 35 years had assembled the largest, best-equipped army in the Roman world. He had the numbers, the supplies, the strategic advantage. All he had to do was destroy Caesar's isolated force before Antony could arrive with reinforcements. What happened next would be one of the strangest sieges in military history. A siege where Caesar besieged Pompey despite being outnumbered and outgunned. And it would end in Caesar's worst defeat, a catastrophic failure that should have ended his career forever. But somehow, it didn't. July 48th BC. Caesar's army was dying, not from battle, but from hunger. His legions had besieged Pompey's forces at Dyrrachium, a coastal fortress in what is now Albania. Caesar built a 15-mile wall of fortifications, trying to trap Pompey against the sea, but Pompey controlled the harbor. He could be resupplied by ship indefinitely. Caesar could not. His soldiers were eating roots, bark, and a bread substitute made from a grass called cara that caused dysentery. Men were collapsing from malnutrition. Morale was fracturing. Then Pompey attacked. His forces broke through Caesar's fortifications in a coordinated assault that nearly destroyed Caesar's entire army. Caesar's legions fled. It wasn't a retreat, it was a rout. 1,000 of Caesar's best soldiers died. Entire cohorts broke. It was the worst defeat of Caesar's military career. Pompey could have pursued and annihilated Caesar's starving, demoralized army right there. Instead, he stopped. He didn't chase. Later, Caesar would say, "Today the enemy would have won if they had a commander who knew how to win." The siege at Dyrrachium had begun in late spring as a desperate attempt by Caesar to force a decisive battle. Pompey had positioned his army along the coast, using the sea as a shield for his back and relying on his naval superiority for constant resupply. Caesar, despite being outnumbered and undersupplied, attempted to blockade Pompey by constructing a massive circumvallation, a wall that would completely encircle Pompey's position and cut him off from the surrounding countryside. In 4 weeks, Caesar's legionaries built 15 miles of fortifications, including ditches, wooden palisades, and watchtowers. Think about that for a second. 15 miles of siege works, constructed while under constant harassment from Pompey's superior cavalry, built by soldiers who were already hungry and exhausted from forced marches. The engineering feat was remarkable. The strategic logic was insane. Caesar was trying to besiege an army that had access to the sea, naval supply lines, and twice his numbers. He might as well have tried to besiege the ocean itself. Here's what the Roman chronicles don't tell you. Caesar knew the plan was desperate from the start, but he had no choice. Mark Antony had finally arrived with reinforcements, 4 legions that brought Caesar's total force to about 35,000 men. But those reinforcements came without supplies. Caesar's army was now larger, but even hungrier. He needed to force Pompey into battle before his own army literally starved to death. The circumvallation was a gamble. If it worked, Pompey would be trapped and forced to fight. If it failed, Caesar would be exposed and vulnerable. It failed catastrophically. By early July, Caesar's soldiers were surviving on Cara, a marsh grass that, when ground into flour and mixed with water, produced a barely edible bread that caused severe intestinal distress. Ancient sources report that when Caesar's soldiers showed Pompey's troops this bread, the Pompeians were horrified and reportedly said, "We are fighting wild beasts, not men." Men were fainting during sentry duty. Cavalry horses were dying from lack of fodder. The army's combat effectiveness was degrading by the day. Pompey, meanwhile, was well-fed, well-rested, and receiving fresh supplies daily by ship. His army had been reinforced to approximately 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. He watched Caesar's fortifications go up and recognized them for what they were: the desperate move of a trapped general running out of options. On July 10th, Pompey attacked. His scouts had found a weak point in Caesar's southern wall where 2 fortification lines didn't quite connect, a gap of perhaps 600 yards. Pompey sent 60 cohorts, approximately 24,000 men, in a coordinated assault supported by cavalry and archers. They hit Caesar's defenses like a hammer, overwhelming the thinly stretched defenders. Caesar's 9th Legion, holding that section, broke under the pressure. The cohorts fled. Panic spread. Other units, seeing the 9th retreat, abandoned their positions. In less than 2 hours, Caesar's entire southern fortification line collapsed. His legionaries were running, not withdrawing in good order, but genuinely fleeing in terror. It was unprecedented. These were veterans of the Gallic Wars, men who had held the walls at Alesia against impossible odds. Now they were routing like untrained recruits. The casualties tell the story. 960 legionaries killed, 32 centurions dead. And centurions, the backbone of Roman military leadership, never died in those numbers unless their units were being slaughtered or unless they refused to retreat while their men fled. Caesar himself rode into the chaos, reportedly grabbing fleeing soldiers by their standards, trying physically to stop the rout. It didn't work. His army was finished. Pompey's forces controlled the breached fortifications. Caesar's siege was over. His starving army was exposed on open ground with Pompey's well-fed legions advancing. This was the moment Pompey could have ended the civil war. His cavalry could have pursued Caesar's fleeing troops, turned the rout into a massacre, captured or killed Caesar himself. One vigorous pursuit, and the Republic would be saved. Pompey ordered his troops to halt and consolidate the captured fortifications. He didn't pursue. Ancient sources suggest Pompey suspected a trap. After all, Caesar was famous for his tactical tricks. More likely, Pompey was simply cautious. He had won the engagement. Why risk his advantage by chasing a defeated enemy into uncertain terrain? Caesar's shattered army retreated 30 miles south, gathering stragglers and trying desperately to restore order. When they finally stopped and counted survivors, the scale of the disaster became clear. Nearly 1,000 dead, hundreds more wounded, morale shattered. The invincible army that had conquered Gaul had just been humiliated. But here's what makes this defeat so crucial. It should have ended Caesar. A weaker commander would have retreated to Italy, sued for peace, or simply given up. Caesar did none of those things. Instead, he withdrew to Thessaly, regrouped his starving army, and began preparing for one final confrontation. Because Caesar understood something Pompey didn't. Momentum in war isn't just about winning battles. It's about who refuses to accept defeat. And Caesar was about to prove that one perfect battle could erase a dozen disasters. August 48th BC. Caesar's army limped into Thessaly, a fertile plain in central Greece, desperately seeking food and a place to make a stand. Pompey followed cautiously, his army now swollen to over 50,000 men. His cavalry numbered 7,000, the largest mounted force assembled in the Roman world. Caesar had 1,000 cavalry, most of them Gauls and Germans who had followed him from the northern campaigns. The two armies met near the town of Pharsalus. The plain stretched wide and flat, perfect cavalry terrain, which meant perfect terrain for Pompey. Caesar's exhausted infantry couldn't outrun Pompey's horsemen. His flanks were vulnerable. His supply situation was desperate. Every military advantage belonged to Pompey. The Senate's faction was confident. This would be where Caesar's luck finally ran out, where the upstart general who had defied the Republic would be crushed by Rome's greatest commander. Pompey's officers were already arguing about how to divide Caesar's estates after the victory. But Julius Caesar had spent the last week studying the terrain, observing Pompey's formations, and calculating the one move that could save his doomed army. The plain of Pharsalus stretched approximately 3 miles wide, bordered by the Inopius River to the south and rolling hills to the north. The ground was flat, firm, and completely open, ideal for cavalry maneuvers, disastrous for an outnumbered infantry force. Ancient tactical doctrine was clear. Cavalry controlled the flanks, and whoever controlled the flanks controlled the battle. Pompey had 7, cavalry to Caesar's 1. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Here's what made Pompey's position so overwhelming. He didn't just have more cavalry, he had the best cavalry. His 7,000 horsemen included Syrian auxiliaries trained in archery from horseback, Thracian mercenaries famous for their hit-and-run tactics, and Roman equites, wealthy citizens who could afford horses and armor. These weren't random mounted soldiers. They were specialists who had trained together for months, who understood coordinated maneuvers, who could execute complex flanking movements with precision. Caesar's 1,000 cavalry, by contrast, were mostly Germanic and Gallic tribesmen, fierce individual fighters, but undisciplined by Roman standards. They fought like barbarians because they were barbarians, more comfortable raiding than executing complex battlefield maneuvers. Against Pompey's numerical and qualitative advantage, they were functionally irrelevant. Everyone knew it, including Caesar. Think about the pressure Pompey was facing from his own side. For weeks, his officers and the senators traveling with his army had been demanding he engage Caesar in battle. They mocked his caution, questioned his courage, accused him of prolonging the war to maintain his political importance. "Are you enjoying being surrounded by kings and senators?" one officer reportedly sneered, suggesting Pompey liked having Rome's elite dependent on him. The political pressure was becoming unbearable. Pompey the Great, the man who had never lost a major battle, was being called a coward by politicians who had never held a sword. On August 7th, Pompey finally agreed to give battle. His scouts had located Caesar's army camped on the plain near Pharsalus. The terrain was perfect. His supplies were abundant. His camp had fresh bread, wine, meat, everything an army needed. Caesar's camp, by contrast, was subsisting on foraged grain and whatever livestock they could requisition from terrified local farmers. Pompey's soldiers were well-rested, well-fed, and confident. Caesars were exhausted, half-starved, and demoralized from the disaster at Dyrrachium. The numbers told the whole story. Pompey commanded approximately 45,000 heavy infantry organized into 110 cohorts, 7,000 cavalry, plus archers and slingers, roughly 52,000 combatants total. Caesar had 22,000 infantry in 80 cohorts and 1,000 cavalry, perhaps 23,000 men total. Pompey outnumbered Caesar more than 2 to 1 in infantry and 7 to 1 in cavalry. On paper, this wasn't a battle. It was an execution. But here's what Pompey's officers didn't understand. Caesar wasn't looking for a fair fight. He was looking for an asymmetric advantage, some tactical innovation that could offset Pompey's overwhelming numerical superiority. And during the week, both armies spent maneuvering around each other. Caesar found it. He had watched Pompey's camp, studied his formations, observed how Pompey deployed his troops during daily drills, and Caesar noticed a pattern. Pompey massed his cavalry on his left wing, always the left, positioned to sweep around an enemy's right flank and attack from the side and rear. It was textbook Roman tactics. It had worked for Pompey dozens of times. It would work again here because Caesar's pathetic cavalry screen couldn't possibly stop 7,000 horsemen. Except Caesar wasn't planning to stop them with cavalry. On August 8th, the night before the battle, Caesar called his senior officers to his tent and revealed a plan that made them stare in disbelief. He would pull 3,000 of his best men, veterans from the 10th Legion, out of the main battle line and hide them as a fourth line behind his cavalry, angled obliquely toward where Pompey's cavalry would attack. The officers protested. Pulling 3,000 men from the main line would weaken it further. Caesar would be facing Pompey's 45,000 infantry with only 19,000. The math was suicide, but Caesar's logic was coldly precise. Pompey's cavalry will sweep our right flank. When they do, the fourth line will destroy them. Without his cavalry, Pompey loses his flanking advantage. Then we fight infantry against infantry, and our infantry is better. It was the kind of all-or-nothing gamble that defined Caesar's entire career. If the fourth line failed to stop the cavalry, Caesar's army would be surrounded and massacred. If it worked, Pompey's perfect plan would collapse in minutes. As dawn broke on August 9th, 48 BC, 74,000 Romans prepared to settle the future of the Republic in blood. Caesar stood before his exhausted legionaries and reportedly said, "Today we fight not for glory, but for survival. We are outnumbered, but we are not outmatched. Remember Gaul? Remember what we've overcome. They have the numbers. We have each other." Across the field, Pompey the Great stood surrounded by senators and nobility, confident that by sunset, the upstart Caesar would be dead or captured, and the Republic would be saved. What neither man knew was that in the next 4 hours, one brilliant tactical decision would kill 15,000 Romans, shatter the greatest army in the world, and end the Republic forever. The plain of Pharsalus was about to become Rome's graveyard. Dawn broke over the Enipeos River, and 74,000 Romans prepared to kill each other. Pompey's army formed up on the northern side of the plain, 45,000 heavy infantry organized into traditional three-line formation, 7,000 cavalry massed on his left wing, light infantry and archers scattered among them. His plan was simple and devastating. His cavalry would sweep around Caesar's right flank, roll up his line from the side and rear, and crush his infantry between hammer and anvil. It was textbook Roman tactics, executed with overwhelming force. Caesar's army, half the size and starving, formed up opposite them. 22,000 legionaries, many of them veterans of Gaul, stood in their cohorts, shields locked, javelins ready. They knew the odds. They could see Pompey's cavalry massing across the field, 7 times their number, preparing to flank them. And they stood anyway, because Caesar had promised them one thing: we win today, or we die here. Then, as the sun rose higher and the heat began to build, Caesar did something that made his officers stare in confusion. He pulled 3,000 of his best men, veterans from the 10th Legion, out of formation and hid them behind his cavalry in a fourth line, angled obliquely toward Pompey's approaching horsemen. The visual spectacle of both armies deploying was overwhelming. Pompey's formations stretched nearly 2 miles across the plain, a wall of shields, armor, and iron that seemed to have no end. His cohorts were arranged in the traditional Roman triplex asces, 3 lines of infantry, each line 10 men deep. First line, the hastati, younger soldiers who would engage first. Second line, the principes, experienced veterans who would reinforce when the hastati tired. Third line, the triarii, the oldest and most disciplined troops who served as the final reserve. It was a formation that had conquered the Mediterranean world, refined over centuries of warfare, executed now with overwhelming numerical superiority. Here's what made Pompey's deployment so terrifying: depth. His cohorts were organized 10 men deep, creating a formation that could sustain casualties and still maintain integrity. When the front rank fell, the second rank stepped forward. When the second fell, the third stepped up. It was a meat grinder designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Against Caesar's thinner lines, stretched desperately to match Pompey's frontage, the depth advantage was potentially decisive. Caesar's formation, by contrast, looked anemic. His 22,000 infantry had to cover the same frontage as Pompey's 45,000, which meant his lines were thinner, more vulnerable to breakthrough. He arranged his cohorts in 3 lines as well, but each line was only 6 men deep in most places, half Pompey's depth. The mathematics were brutal. When the lines met, Pompey's superior depth would allow him to maintain pressure even as casualties mounted. Caesar's thinner formations would crack first. Think about what Caesar's soldiers were seeing as they stood in formation. Across the field, Pompey's army looked like an iron ocean. The morning sun reflected off thousands of helmets, shields, and spear points. The cavalry on Pompey's left wing, 7,000 mounted soldiers, covered nearly a quarter-mile of frontage, horses stamping, riders adjusting their positions. Behind the main lines, supply wagons, medical tents, and reserve cohorts stretched back for miles. This was the largest Roman army assembled in a generation, and it was pointing directly at them. But here's where Caesar's genius became apparent. Those 3,000 men pulled from his main line, the fourth line that confused his officers, were positioned at a 45-degree angle behind his cavalry on the right wing. They weren't in the traditional formation. They were hidden, kneeling in the tall grass, invisible to Pompey's scouts and cavalry across the field. Caesar had given them specific, brutal instructions. When Pompey's cavalry charges, let our horsemen fall back. Let the enemy think they're winning. Then stand up and attack. Don't throw your javelins. Use them as spears. Aim for the horses' faces and the riders' eyes. Make them fear coming close. Break their charge, and we break their army. The fourth line consisted entirely of veterans from the 10th Legion, Caesar's most loyal, most experienced cohort. These were men who had fought at Alesia, who had built the bridge across the Rhine, who had stormed fortified Gallic hill forts in driving rain, and held the line against Germanic warriors twice their size. They were Caesar's elite, and he was betting everything on their discipline and lethality. Pompey, meanwhile, stood with his command staff on a slight rise overlooking the battlefield, surrounded by senators in togas and military tribunes in gleaming armor. He watched Caesar's formations with satisfaction. The numerical advantage was even more pronounced than intelligence had suggested. Pompey's forces outnumbered Caesar's by more than 2-1 overall, and his cavalry advantage was overwhelming. His cavalry commander, Titus Labienus, Caesar's former officer who had defected to Pompey, was confident and eager. "Their right flank will collapse in the first charge," Labienus reportedly told Pompey. "We'll be in their rear within an hour." Pompey gave the order for his army to advance to combat positions. 45,000 men moved forward in synchronized lines, shields locked, maintaining formation. The sound was overwhelming. Armor clinking, officers shouting cadence, thousands of hobnailed sandals striking the ground in rhythm. The dust rose in clouds. The earth itself seemed to shake. Caesar's legionaries watched them come and held their ground. They were outnumbered, outflanked, and starving. But they had Julius Caesar, and Caesar had never lost when it mattered. Their faith in their commander was absolute, even if the logic of the situation screamed that they were about to die. At approximately 10 a.m., with the sun climbing toward its zenith and the August heat building to oppressive levels, Pompey gave the final order. His cavalry, 7,000 strong, began moving toward Caesar's right flank at a walk, then a trot, then a full gallop. The ground thundered. The greatest cavalry charge in Roman history was about to collide with 1,000 Germanic barbarians and whatever tricks Caesar had hidden behind them. In the tall grass, 3,000 legionaries from the 10th Legion gripped their javelins, watched the dust cloud of approaching cavalry grow larger, and waited for the signal to stand up and change the course of history. Pompey stood on a small rise overlooking the battlefield, surrounded by senators and Roman nobility who had come to watch Caesar's destruction. His battle plan was flawless. His $7,000 cavalry, supported by light infantry and archers, would advance on his left wing. They would sweep aside Caesar's pathetic 1,000 horsemen. An afterthought, really. Then wheel inward and attack Caesar's legions from the flank and rear. His infantry would advance simultaneously, pinning Caesar's front line in place. Caught between cavalry from behind and infantry in front, Caesar's formations would collapse. His exhausted, half-starved legionaries would break and run. It would be a massacre. Pompey had used this tactic before. It had never failed. His cavalry commander, Titus Labienus, was one of the best in Rome. Ironically, he had served under Caesar in Gaul before defecting to Pompey. Labienus knew how Caesar fought. He knew Caesar's weaknesses, and he was confident that today, those weaknesses would kill him. What Labienus didn't know was that Caesar had spent the last week drilling his hidden fourth line in a new kind of fighting, something Roman cavalry had never faced before, something that would turn Pompey's perfect plan into a death trap. The cavalry deployment Pompey had ordered was textbook perfection. His 7,000 horsemen were organized into multiple squadrons positioned on his left wing, the side closest to Caesar's vulnerable right flank. The front squadrons consisted of Roman and Italian cavalry, heavily armed riders on powerful horses bred specifically for warfare. Behind them came the auxiliaries, Syrian mounted archers who could fire accurately at full gallop, Thracian light cavalry trained in hit-and-run tactics, and Cappadocian horsemen famous for their discipline under fire. The formation was layered, flexible, and designed to overwhelm any opposition through sheer mass and coordinated movement. Here's what made this plan so devastating. Roman cavalry doctrine emphasized momentum and shock. Cavalry didn't win battles by trading blows with infantry. Cavalry won by breaking formations, creating panic, and exploiting gaps. Pompey's 7,000 horsemen would hit Caesar's right flank like an avalanche. Caesar's 1,000 Germanic and Gallic cavalry couldn't possibly hold against that force. They would scatter or die. and then Pompey's cavalry would have free access to Caesar's exposed flank and rear. Think about the tactical mathematics Pompey was executing. Once his cavalry swept around Caesar's right wing, they would attack Caesar's infantry from the side and rear. The most vulnerable positions for any formation. Roman legionaries were trained to fight in tight formations, shields locked, presenting a solid front to the enemy. But that formation only worked when attacked from the front. Hit from the side, the formation's integrity collapsed. Hit from the rear, soldiers couldn't even see what was killing them. Men would panic, break ranks, and run. And once one cohort broke, the panic would spread like fire through dry grass. Labienus, commanding Pompey's cavalry, understood this perfectly. He had fought under Caesar for 8 years, in Gaul. He knew Caesar's tactical preferences, his favorite maneuvers, his tendencies under pressure. Labienus had defected to Pompey in 49 BC, bringing with him intimate knowledge of Caesar's army, its capabilities, and its weaknesses. He knew that Caesar's right-wing cavalry consisted mostly of Germanic and Gallic barbarians, fierce fighters individually, but lacking Roman discipline and coordination. Against a 7-to-1 numerical disadvantage, they would last minutes at best. But here's where Pompey's plan reached a level of tactical brilliance that should have been unbeatable. He didn't just mass his cavalry on one wing and hope for the best. He coordinated the entire battle around the cavalry attack. His infantry would advance simultaneously, engaging Caesar's front line and pinning them in place. This meant Caesar couldn't pull troops from his center or left to reinforce his threatened right wing. Doing so would create gaps that Pompey's infantry would exploit. Caesar would be forced to watch his right flank collapse while being unable to do anything about it. It was a strategic checkmate. The senators and nobility surrounding Pompey watched the deployment with satisfaction and growing excitement. Marcus Cato, Caesar's bitter political enemy, reportedly remarked, "By nightfall, we'll be dining in Caesar's camp." Others were already discussing how to divide Caesar's confiscated estates, which magistrates would be appointed to govern the provinces, how the republic would be restored once this upstart dictator was eliminated. The victory seemed so certain that they were treating it as a fait accompli. Pompey gave his final orders to Labienus at approximately 9:45 a.m. The cavalry advance would begin in 15 minutes, coordinated with the infantry's forward movement. Labienus would lead the charge personally, at the head of the Roman cavalry squadrons. The auxiliaries would follow, then wheel inward once Caesar's cavalry was broken. Speed was essential. Hit hard, hit fast, and don't give Caesar time to react or adjust. What neither Pompey nor Labienus could see from their command position was the anomaly in Caesar's formation. That fourth line of 3,000 men, hidden in the tall grass behind Caesar's cavalry, was positioned at an angle that made it nearly invisible from Pompey's vantage point. And even if they had seen it, they likely would have dismissed it as a reserve formation, nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Here's what the Roman military chronicles don't tell you. Caesar had drilled those 3,000 men in a completely new tactical doctrine over the previous week. Standard Roman infantry doctrine said you threw your pilum, your heavy javelin, at the enemy when they were 20 to 30 yards away, then drew your gladius and charged into close combat. Caesar had ordered his fourth line to do the exact opposite. "Don't throw your javelins," he had told them repeatedly. "Hold them. Use them like spears. When the cavalry charges, wait until they're close, 10 yards, 5 yards, then stand up and stab upward. Aim for the horses' faces, aim for the riders' eyes, make them afraid to come near you." It was a radical departure from standard tactics, and it only worked because these were veterans who trusted Caesar absolutely. Any other troops would have broken formation when 7,000 horsemen thundered toward them. Caesar's 10th Legion would hold because they had held at Alesia, because they had followed Caesar through 8 years of impossible victories, because they believed he had never been wrong before and wouldn't start being wrong now. At 10:00 Sem, Pompey gave the signal. Trumpets blared across the plain. His 7,000 cavalry began to move forward, starting at a walk, building to a trot. The ground trembled. Dust rose in enormous clouds. The greatest cavalry charge of the Roman Civil War was beginning. Labienus, riding at the front, saw Caesar's thin cavalry screen ahead. Barely 1,000 riders, already looking nervous, already starting to pull back. This would be over in minutes. Then the real slaughter would begin, when they hit Caesar's infantry from behind. What Labienus couldn't see was 3,000 legionaries lying flat in the grass, gripping their javelins, counting their heartbeats, waiting for the moment when the entire weight of Pompey's cavalry would ride past Caesar's retreating horsemen and discover that the ground ahead of them wasn't empty at all. At approximately 10 a.m., Pompey gave the order. His entire line began to advance. 45,000 men moving forward in formation, shields raised, hobnailed sandals striking the ground in rhythm. The noise was overwhelming, armor clinking, officers shouting commands, thousands of men breathing hard as they crossed the field. Caesar's legionaries waited. Standard Roman doctrine said you charged when the enemy reached javelin range, about 30 yards. You threw your pilum, the 7-foot throwing spear designed to punch through shields and armor. Then you drew your gladius and closed for hand-to-hand combat. But Pompey had ordered his men to stand and receive Caesar's charge. He wanted Caesar's soldiers to exhaust themselves running across the field, then hit them when they arrived tired and disordered. It was a good plan. Caesar's men advanced halfway across the field, then stopped. They didn't charge. They reformed their lines, caught their breath, then advanced again. When they reached javelin range, 22,000 arms drew back and released. The sky went dark. Thousands of heavy iron javelins arced through the air and came down like steel rain on Pompey's front ranks. The Roman pilum was one of the most effective infantry weapons ever designed. 7 feet long, with a 4-foot iron shank topped by a pyramidal point, it weighed between 4 and 9 pounds. When thrown by a trained soldier at 30 yards, it hit with enough force to punch through a shield, through the armor behind it, and into the man holding it. The iron shank was designed to bend on. Impact, making the javelin impossible to pull out quickly and rendering the enemy's shield useless. You either dropped your shield or tried to fight with 7 feet of bent iron hanging from it. 22,000 pila hit Pompey's front ranks simultaneously. The sound was like hail on a tin roof, but each impact was a man screaming, falling, or dropping his shield. Ancient sources don't provide exact casualty figures for this initial exchange, but modern military historians estimate that a well-executed pilum volley could disable 10–15% of an enemy formation, either through direct casualties or by forcing soldiers to abandon damaged shields. That means Pompey's front line took between 4,000 and 7,000 casualties or equipment losses in the first 30 seconds of contact. But here's where Pompey's tactical decision to stand and receive the charge became brilliant and terrible simultaneously. His men didn't have to throw their pila in response because they weren't advancing. They held their javelins, standing in formation, waiting for Caesar's exhausted infantry to close the final 30 yards. When Caesar's legionaries, having thrown their javelins, drew their gladi and charged, they ran into a wall of men who still had javelins ready. Think about that tactical exchange. Caesar's soldiers, already tired from weeks of malnutrition and now exhausted from crossing half the battlefield, had just thrown away their primary standoff weapon. They were charging into fresh troops who still held theirs. Pompey's front ranks released their pila at point-blank range, less than 15 yards. At that distance, there was no dodging, no raising shields in time. Men simply fell. The two lines collided at approximately 10:07 a.m. with a sound that eyewitnesses compared to thunder. Shield hits shield. Gladius stabbed between gaps in armor. Men pushed with their entire body weight, trying to force the enemy line backward. This was Roman close-quarters combat at its most brutal. Not the choreographed sword fights of movies, but compressed, desperate shoving matches, where men stabbed at anything they could reach and hoped the soldiers beside them were doing the same. The combat was so close that soldiers couldn't swing their swords. They could only thrust. A gladius thrust aimed at the throat, the belly, the groin, anywhere armor didn't protect. Men in the front ranks lasted minutes before exhaustion or wounds forced them back. The second rank stepped forward immediately, maintaining the line's integrity. This was why depth mattered. Pompey's formations, 10 men deep, could sustain this grinding attrition far longer than Caesar's 6 deep lines. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. Despite being outnumbered more than 2-1, despite being exhausted and half-starved, Caesar's infantry held. The center held. The left wing held. These were veterans of 8 years in Gaul, men who had fought Germanic warriors, besieged fortified hilltops, and held the walls at Alesia against 250,000 Gauls. They knew how to lock shields, rotate fresh men to the front, and maintain formation even when the soldier beside them fell screaming. Pompey's numerical advantage meant constant pressure, but Caesar's experience meant disciplined resistance. The battle in the center became a brutal stalemate. Both lines pushed. Both lines held. Casualties mounted on both sides, men falling with sword wounds, trampled by their own soldiers, dying from exhaustion and heat as much as from enemy weapons. The August sun beat down mercilessly. Men fought in formations so compressed they could barely breathe. The smell of blood, sweat, and human waste, men losing control of their bowels in terror, filled the air. But the center was never meant to decide this battle. Both commanders knew that. The real fight was happening on the flanks, where cavalry and tactical innovation were about to collide in ways that would shock even seasoned military observers. At 10:15 a.m., while the infantry ground against each other in the center, Pompey's 7,000 cavalry completed their approach toward Caesar's right wing. Caesar's 1,000 Germanic and Gallic horsemen, seeing the massive force thundering toward them, did exactly what everyone expected. They broke and ran. Labienus, leading Pompey's cavalry, saw Caesar's horsemen fleeing and knew the battle was won. His cavalry swept past the retreating enemy riders and wheeled inward, preparing to hit Caesar's infantry from the flank and rear. The maneuver was perfect. The execution was flawless. In 60 seconds, they would be behind Caesar's lines, attacking men who couldn't defend themselves. Then 3,000 legionaries stood up from the grass where they'd been hiding and changed the course of Roman history. While the infantry clashed in the center, Pompey's cavalry struck. 7,000 mounted soldiers, the finest riders Rome could field, thundered across the plain toward Caesar's right wing. They came in formation, lances lowered, a wall of horseflesh and steel moving at full gallop. Caesar's 1,000 cavalry, Germans and Gauls who fought like barbarians, tried to meet them. They lasted minutes. Outnumbered 7-1, they were simply swept aside, pushed back, scattered. Pompey's horsemen wheeled inward, exactly as planned, and prepared to roll up Caesar's exposed flank. Caesar's infantry on the right wing saw them coming. They were about to be hit from the side by thousands of cavalry while fighting Pompey's legions to their front. This was the moment battles were lost, when formations broke and men ran, because staying meant certain death. But these weren't ordinary soldiers. These were Caesar's veterans, men who had held the line at Alesia against impossible odds. who had marched through Gaul for 8 years and learned that Caesar didn't lose. They stood their ground, reformed their ranks inward to meet the cavalry, and waited for the hammer to fall. Then Caesar sprang his trap. The initial cavalry engagement lasted exactly 4 minutes, from 10:11 to 10:15 a.m. Ancient chroniclers, particularly Caesar's own commentaries, described the encounter in brutal detail. Caesar's Germanic cavalry, led by chieftains who had fought for him since the Rhine campaigns, rode out to meet Pompey's approaching horsemen, knowing they were massively outnumbered. They tried to use mobility and individual fighting skill to offset the numerical disadvantage. It didn't work. Pompey's cavalry hit them like a tsunami. Think about the physics of a cavalry charge. 7,000 horses moving at full gallop, each weighing between 900 and 200 pounds, carrying riders in armor, wielding lances and swords. The combined kinetic energy was overwhelming. Caesar's Germanic riders tried to fight, tried to hold ground, but they were simply crushed by mass and momentum. Some were unhorsed by lance strikes, others were trampled. The survivors broke and fled, exactly as Pompey's plan anticipated. Labienus, commanding Pompey's cavalry from the front ranks, watched Caesar's horsemen scatter and felt the surge of certainty that comes with a plan executed perfectly. His cavalry regrouped quickly, another sign of their superior discipline and training. They didn't pursue the fleeing riders. Instead, they wheeled inward in coordinated squadrons, turning toward Caesar's exposed right flank, where the infantry cohorts stood watching. Here's what made this moment so terrifying for Caesar's right-wing cohorts. They could see death coming and couldn't do anything about it. To their front, Pompey's infantry pressed hard, shields locked, gladi thrusting. The cohorts were fully engaged, committed to holding the line. They couldn't turn to face the cavalry without exposing their backs to the enemy infantry. They couldn't retreat without breaking formation and triggering a general collapse. All they could do was stand and wait for 7,000 horsemen to hit them from the side. Roman infantry doctrine had no good answer for this situation. Cavalry attacking from the flank or rear was a worst-case scenario that usually meant the battle was lost. Soldiers couldn't maintain shield wall integrity while defending in multiple directions. The formation would fragment, cohesion would collapse, and men would die or run. But Caesar's veterans did something that defied standard doctrine. The cohorts on the right wing, while still maintaining pressure against Pompey's frontline infantry, angled their rear ranks outward, creating a refused flank, a formation that could at least present shields and spears toward the approaching cavalry. It was a desperate measure, the kind of battlefield adaptation that only experienced soldiers could execute under pressure. It wouldn't stop the cavalry, but it might buy seconds, and seconds might matter if Caesar had a plan. Caesar had a plan. At 10:15 a.m., as Pompey's cavalry completed their wheel and accelerated toward Caesar's infantry, preparing for the killing blow that would shatter the entire right wing, the fourth line stood up. 3,000 men who had been lying flat in the tall grass, invisible to Pompey's scouts and cavalry, rose to their feet in perfect formation. They were positioned at a 45-degree angle to the cavalry's approach, close enough that the horsemen couldn't avoid them, angled so they could strike the cavalry's flank as it passed. Labienus saw them rise and had perhaps 3 seconds to process what was happening. 3,000 infantry in fresh formation, gripping javelins not as throwing weapons, but as 9-foot spears held low and pointed outward. They weren't throwing and retreating. They were standing and advancing, moving directly into the path of his cavalry charge. Here's where Caesar's tactical innovation became lethal. Cavalry charges work because of momentum and psychological terror. Horses are massive, fast, and intimidating. Infantry, when charged by cavalry, typically either throw their javelins and retreat, or form defensive squares and try to endure. Caesar's fourth line did neither. They advanced aggressively toward the horses, javelins extended like pikes, and aimed for one specific target: the horses' faces and the riders' eyes. Ancient sources, particularly Plutarch and Appian, describe what happened next with a mixture of awe and horror. The lead squadrons of Pompey's cavalry, moving at full gallop, suddenly found themselves facing a wall of iron points thrust directly at their horses' heads. Horses, unlike men, can't be trained to charge into sharp objects they can see coming. When a javelin point appears directly in front of a horse's face, the horse rears, turns, or stops. Instinct overrides training. The front rank of Caesar's fourth line stabbed upward. Javelins pierced horses' nostrils, eyes, necks. Riders, focused on maintaining formation and controlling their mounts at high speed, suddenly faced weapons thrust at their faces from below. They pulled back on their reins instinctively, trying to protect themselves. Horses screamed, men fell. The charge's momentum shattered. Think about the cascade effect. The front squadrons, maybe 500, 600 riders, hit Caesar's fourth line and disintegrated. Horses reared, throwing riders. Wounded animals panicked and bolted. But behind them came the second wave. Another 1,000 riders moving too fast to stop. They collided with the chaos ahead of them. Horses crashed into each other. Formations disintegrated. The coordinated cavalry charge became a confused mass of terrified animals and desperate riders. The fourth line didn't stop advancing. They pushed forward, jabbing with their javelins, targeting any horse or rider within reach. Men who had spent 8 years fighting in Gaul, who had learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation, now systematically dismantled Pompey's cavalry. Riders who fell were surrounded and stabbed. Horses that turned to flee were chased and brought down. The slaughter was methodical, brutal, and shockingly fast. By 10:18 a.m., 3 minutes after the fourth line stood up, Pompey's cavalry charge had completely collapsed. Thousands of riders were fleeing back toward their own lines in absolute chaos. Labienus, veteran commander who had fought alongside Caesar for 8 years, could only watch in horror as his perfect flanking maneuver disintegrated into panicked retreat. The impossible had just happened. 3,000 infantry had destroyed 7,000 cavalry in less than 4 minutes of contact. The numbers defied every principle of ancient warfare. And Caesar's fourth line, having shattered Pompey's mounted force, didn't stop to celebrate. They turned toward Pompey's left-wing infantry, the cohorts that had been advancing to support the cavalry, and charged. The 3,000 soldiers Caesar had hidden in his fourth line, the ones positioned obliquely behind his cavalry, had been watching the entire cavalry battle unfold. They had seen Pompey's horsemen sweep aside Caesar's riders. They had seen the enemy cavalry wheel inward, preparing to strike. And now, as 7,000 Roman and allied horsemen charged toward Caesar's flank in a dense, confident mass, the fourth line stood up and attacked. But they didn't attack like infantry usually attacked cavalry. Caesar had given them specific orders. Don't throw your javelins. Use them like spears. Aim for the faces. Roman cavalry in 48 BC weren't like medieval knights in full armor. They wore leather or light mail, open-faced helmets, and fought primarily with their mobility and mass. They weren't expecting heavy infantry to stand and fight them hand to hand. And they definitely weren't expecting 3,000 veteran legionaries to sprint forward and start jabbing 7-foot javelins directly at their faces. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Horses reared, screaming. Riders pulled back to protect their faces, losing control of their mounts. Men fell, The cavalry charge didn't just stop, it disintegrated. Within minutes, Pompey's 7,000 cavalry were fleeing in absolute chaos. August 9th, 48 BC. A plain in Thessaly, Greece. Two Roman armies face each other. Julius Caesar commands 22,000 starving, exhausted soldiers. Gnaeus Pompey the Great commands 52,000 well-fed troops, backed by 7,000 cavalry. The numbers say Pompey should win easily. In 4 hours, Caesar will destroy him completely. Caesar's army had been chasing Pompey across Greece for months, starving and desperate. They were eating grass bread mixed with roots and whatever vegetation they could forage. Many soldiers hadn't seen meat in weeks. They were exhausted from constant marching, reduced to 22,000 effectives from disease and desertion. Pompey's forces, by contrast, were well supplied from his control of the sea routes. His 52,000 troops were rested, well-fed, and confident. He had the Senate's backing, Rome's treasury, and the political legitimacy of defending the Republic. His 7,000 cavalry represented an overwhelming advantage. Caesar had maybe 1,000 horsemen. Pompey's battle plan was textbook Roman doctrine. Fix Caesar's infantry with his superior numbers, then use his massive cavalry wing to sweep around Caesar's right flank, attack from behind, and roll up the entire line. Standard flanking maneuver. Against an outnumbered, exhausted enemy, it should have been a massacre. The Senate had already started dividing Caesar's estates. Victory was certain. It should have worked. It didn't. Caesar did something no Roman commander had ever tried. He pulled 3,000 of his best veterans, experienced soldiers from his elite 10th Legion, from his rear lines and hid them behind his cavalry on the right flank, positioned oblique to Pompey's line of sight. The dust and positioning meant Pompey couldn't see them from his command post. These weren't ordinary troops. They were men who had spent 8 years in Gaul perfecting the art of warfare. They knew how to kill efficiently and follow complex orders under pressure. Caesar gave them specific, counterintuitive instructions. When Pompey's cavalry charges and our cavalry retreats, stand up from the grass. Don't throw your javelins as projectiles like normal. Hold them like 9-foot pikes. Lower them, point them forward, and advance into the charge. Aim for the horses' faces and chests. This was revolutionary. Cavalry dominated ancient warfare through psychological terror. The sound and sight of thousands of pounds of horseflesh thundering toward you broke infantry formations before contact even occurred. Standard infantry responses were all defensive. Retreat to avoid the charge. Form tight defensive squares or throw javelins from distance to disrupt the charge. All 3 responses allowed cavalry to maintain momentum and psychological dominance. Caesar's 4th line did the opposite. They advanced aggressively, closing distance instead of creating it, and turned their throwing weapons into close combat spears. The pilum, held low with point extended, became a 9-foot pike. At 10:15 a.m., Pompey's 7,000 cavalry charged Caesar's right flank in coordinated waves, front squadrons of Roman cavalry, followed by auxiliary horsemen, followed by reserves. Caesar's outnumbered cavalry retreated as planned, opening a gap. Pompey's cavalry surged forward, expecting to sweep around Caesar's flank. Instead, they found Caesar's 4th line rising from the grass, 3,000 men in tight formation with pikes extended. What happened next was catastrophic for Pompey. A horse running at full gallop can't stop on command. It needs distance to decelerate. When a horse running at 25 miles per hour suddenly sees a sharp object pointed directly at its face, animal instinct overrides training. The horse rears violently, turns sharply to avoid the threat, or simply panics and tries to stop. And when a horse rears at full gallop with an armored rider aboard, physics does the rest. the rider is thrown forward over the horse's head or sideways as the horse turns. Those few riders who manage to stay mounted lose all control and offensive capability. They're clinging to a panicked animal, not commanding it. Think about the cascade effect. The front squadrons of Pompey's cavalry hit Caesar's fourth line and disintegrated within seconds. Horses rearing, riders thrown, wounded animals screaming and bolting in random directions. All of this chaos created an obstacle for the cavalry squadrons charging behind them. What should have been a coordinated cavalry charge became a traffic jam of panicked animals and confused, dismounted riders. Caesar's veterans from the 10th Legion exploited this chaos with brutal, practiced efficiency. These were men who knew how to kill quickly and move to the next target. A horse rears, stab the rider while he's off balance. A rider falls. Surround him, multiple spear thrusts. Move on before he can recover. A horse turns to flee, stab its haunches, bring it down, then kill the helpless rider. There was no hesitation, no mercy, no wasted motion. It was industrial-scale slaughter executed by professionals. In 4 minutes, from 10:15 to 10:19 a.m., Pompey's cavalry suffered catastrophic losses. Conservative historical estimates suggest at least 800 or 1,000 riders killed or wounded in the initial contact. Another 500-700 horses were killed, wounded so badly they collapsed, or so traumatized they became uncontrollable. The remaining 5,000-plus cavalry simply fled in genuine terror, many not stopping until they reached Pompey's camp 2 miles away. Let that sink in. In 4 minutes, 3,000 infantry destroyed a 7,000-strong cavalry force. The kill ratio was roughly 3-to-1 in favor of the outnumbered infantry. Caesar's fourth line, having shattered Pompey's cavalry in 4 minutes, didn't celebrate or pause to loot. They immediately pivoted 90 degrees and looked at Pompey's left-wing infantry, approximately 12,000 men, who had been advancing to support the cavalry attack. These cohorts suddenly found themselves in an impossible tactical situation. To their front, Caesar's right-wing infantry held firm, engaged in grinding close-quarters combat. To their right, where their cavalry should have been protecting their flank, there was nothing but fleeing horsemen and Caesar's advancing fourth line. They were about to be hit from 2 directions simultaneously, front and side. At 10:20 a.m., Caesar's fourth line slammed into Pompey's exposed left flank. 3,000 men who had already broken one arm of Pompey's battle plan now attacked the second. Roman infantry formations were designed to fight in one direction, forward. The shield wall, the coordinated rotation of fresh troops to the front rank, the mutual support between soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, all of it assumed the enemy was ahead of you. When attacked from the side, those formations became death traps. Soldiers on the flank couldn't turn to defend without breaking ranks. Those in the center couldn't help without abandoning their positions against Caesar's troops to their front. Officers screamed contradictory orders. The psychological impact was devastating. These men had just watched their cavalry, their guarantee of victory, flee in terror from infantry. Now those same infantry were attacking their flank. At 10:17 a.m., the leftmost cohorts broke. Not individual soldiers deserting, entire units, hundreds of men at once. When 12,000 men run, the units next to them panic. The collapse spread like fire through dry grass. Within 2 minutes, Pompey's entire battle line, 45,000 soldiers, many of them veterans, was in full retreat toward their camp. From the moment Caesar's fourth line hit Pompey's flank to the moment Pompey's entire army was routed, 17 minutes. 17 minutes to destroy the largest, best-equipped army in the Roman world. Caesar's legionaries pursued with merciless efficiency. These men had been starving for weeks, had faced certain death, had survived through discipline. Now they hunted. Between 10:20 and 10:40 a.m., Pompey's army suffered 6,000 casualties during the retreat. That's 300 men dying every minute. Not combat, execution. At 10:50 a.m., Caesar's forces reached Pompey's fortified camp and assaulted it. The defenders didn't fight. They cowered. The psychological collapse was total. In 15 minutes, Caesar's men breached fortifications that should have required hours to overcome. Inside, the slaughter was indiscriminate. Officers killed mid-sentence. Soldiers stabbed while surrendering. Support staff murdered where they stood. Among the dead, dozens of Roman senators who had come to watch Caesar's defeat. By 11:20 a.m., Caesar personally entered the camp and forcibly stopped his men from killing. Pompey the Great, Rome's most decorated general, stood frozen on his command post, watching his cavalry disintegrate. When officers physically dragged him away, he removed his general's cloak, mounted a horse, and fled. He abandoned 25,000 soldiers, abandoned the Senate, abandoned everything. He sailed to Egypt, desperately seeking sanctuary from the boy king Ptolemy. On September 28, 48 BC, when Pompey stepped off his ship, Ptolemy's advisors murdered him and cut off his head as a gift for Caesar. The man who had never lost a major battle in 35 years died in a fishing boat without drawing his weapon. Final casualties. Pompey's army, 15,000 dead, 24,000 captured. Caesar's army, 200 dead, perhaps 1,000 wounded, a 75-to-1 kill ratio. In the age of swords and shields, this shouldn't have been possible. Caesar did something shocking. He showed clemency. The 24,000 prisoners were offered a choice: join his legions or go home. No executions, no slavery. Roughly 8,000 joined Caesar's ranks. The rest were released with safe passage. He pardoned senators who had fought against him, including Cicero and Marcus Brutus. Approximately 150 to 200 senators and equestrians who supported Pompey were forgiven, welcomed back to Rome, their property restored. It was brilliant propaganda. Every pardoned soldier became proof that Caesar wasn't a tyrant. But there was a fatal flaw. You can't buy loyalty with forgiveness. On March 15th, 44 BC, 4 years after Pharsalus, 60 senators surrounded Caesar and stabbed him 23 times. Among the assassins, men Caesar had pardoned. Brutus, whom he treated like a son. Cassius, forgiven after Pharsalus. They killed him claiming to save the Republic. The irony was brutal. Caesar's mercy had spared the men who would murder him. And the final irony? The assassination didn't save the Republic. It triggered more civil wars. By 27 BC, Caesar's heir Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The Battle of Pharsalus lasted less than 4 hours. In those 4 hours, Caesar destroyed the Republic's last legitimate army and secured absolute power over Rome. The tactical innovation was brilliant, using heavy infantry to devastate cavalry through aggressive pike formations. But the strategic consequences were far greater. Pharsalus proved that Rome's republican system had become irrelevant. Power belonged to whoever commanded the most loyal legions. The Senate was fiction. The Constitution was theater. The only thing that mattered was the sword. The Roman Republic, which had stood for 500 years, died on a plain in Thessaly. Everything after, Caesar's dictatorship, his assassination, the civil wars, Augustus, the empire, was just the funeral. Caesar's fourth line, those 3,000 men who stood from the grass and destroyed Pompey's cavalry, did more than win a battle. They killed a political system that had governed the Mediterranean world for 5 centuries. They proved that discipline, loyalty, and tactical brilliance could overcome any numerical advantage. The casualty disparity tells the whole story. 15,000 dead versus 200. That wasn't just tactical skill. It was the difference between soldiers fighting for abstract political principles and soldiers fighting for a commander they believed was invincible. Personal loyalty defeated institutional loyalty. And that outcome doomed the Republic forever.